At DonorsTrust, we talk a lot about donor intent. But what is donor intent? What do we mean when we use those words? Well, recently we hosted a webinar for clients and prospective clients focused on this idea of donor intent, what it is, how donors should think about it, and how it factors into one's legacy planning more broadly. It was a great conversation. We had great attendance on it. And so I wanted to share it with you, with this broader audience, so that we could help some more people around this really important concept. When we think about donor intent, when we think about failures of donor intent, we're also often thinking about Pew Foundation, Carnegie, Ford, these great philanthropists who, if they saw their foundations today, would be shocked at what it is doing because it's so different than some of the beliefs that we know they held when they were alive. But you don't have to be a billionaire to have your donor intent go astray. That's why it's so important to really understand what it is and have it locked up tight. So in this webinar, you're going to first hear the voice of Lawson Bader, DonorsTrust President and CEO, as he kicks things off and introduces us. And then I will take over the interviewing reins of Kim Dennis. Kim is DonorsTrust co-founder and still the board chair here, and is an expert in what it takes to really preserve the charitable legacy of a donor from decades in the philanthropic world and at numerous foundations and day-to-day operations and on boards. And we're going to discuss how to be thoughtful about outlining donor intent, the challenges that can come from later generations trying to interpret donor intent, and how to make that donor intent as bulletproof as possible. There's some real gold in this conversation. We also kept in the Q&A because some of the audience questions were really great and maybe questions that you have yourself. So buckle up, enjoy this. And by the way, we have 2 more webinars on this topic coming soon. On April 22nd, we have a one on how to craft your donor intent statement, so how to actually put the words on paper. And then coming on May 12th, one final webinar that's going to look at how we at DonorsTrust take the donor intent statement, take the history as a donor to really steward that legacy once you are no longer here. I'd love to have you sign up for those, and information for that is going to be in our show notes page. All right. Well, with that, let's kick it over to Lawson.
I'm Lawson Bader, CEO and President of DonorsTrust. Thank you for joining us. We've got a large group to talk about something that is quite important to DonorsTrust. In fact, it's part of the fabric of why we were created in the first place. And the fact that we have so many of you signed up shows that it's important to you as well. So we're very grateful for that. I'm joined by Peter Lipset, Vice President, longtime Vice President of DonorsTrust, as well as Kim Dennis, a familiar face and name to you, to those as well, who is not just founder of DonorsTrust and organizations like the Philanthropy Roundtable, is also our board chair. So yes, I get to say she's my boss. But also most recently, along with Courtney Myers and Rich Tren, have come to us and joined the team as philanthropic advisors from the recently closed Searle Freedom Trust. So it's been a nice addition to have her as an advisor, along with her colleagues, so we can provide a bit more services to our clients besides just offering the transaction of a DAF account, and now be able to work more closely with folks to what it means to do donor intent, what it means to actually develop an ability to assess a grantee, for example. So we're expanding our services, and to the extent that after this call you want to learn more about what that means, then give us a call and we'll talk a bit more about that. But on to the substance of this event, this conversation. Let me turn this over to Peter, and you and Kim can go forth and let's talk about donor intent.
Let's do it. Thank you, Lawson. I'm thrilled to be here. It's so wonderful to look at the list of folks who are here, the dozens and dozens of you, so many friends on this list, so many great clients of DonorsTrust. And I'm excited to have this conversation. We have a bipartite mission at DonorsTrust, as Lawson said. We care about donor intent. We care about growing the liberty movement. And by succeeding on the donor intent front, we do the latter. And so I'm so happy to talk to our board chair, to my friend, Kim Dennis. Kim, let's start by just defining terms. When I say donor intent, which is a term that still doesn't get the airtime it probably deserves, what does donor intent mean to you?
So I'm going to go back in time a bit and date myself here to when I first started working in the philanthropic movement, which was 1980. And back then, donor intent really wasn't talked about as a concept. And that's because people just, they gave the money to the causes they were interested in. And that was that. What started happening in the 1980s is that there was pressure from the left and including the Council on Foundations, and this was on foundations in particular, to sort of start opening their businesses, as it were, to the larger community. And that the thinking behind it was that because donors get the charitable deduction, that tax advantage basically gives the public a claim on those resources. And so there was a lot of pressure on foundations back then. For example, to put members of their grant-making constituencies on their boards. It was the beginning of the whole DEI juggernaut, where foundations were being pressured to diversify their boards. And, if you have a family foundation, that's hard. You can't create diversity where it doesn't exist, right? And so that pressure really resulted in some of the conservative foundations pushing back against that. And that really is where the whole concept of donor intent sort of arose. And it was basically, the argument was, no, the resources of donors are their private resources that they can do what they want with. And it is, it is not incumbent upon them to respond to the pressures from external organizations and groups. And so donor intent to me is very simple. It's donors' right to give their charitable resources where they see fit. That's it. It's pretty simple.
And
Uh,
it's so interesting that that dichotomy of whose money is it really still is playing out. I mean, decades later, it's still a battle that we have to deal with. We know we're on the right side of it because it's
it,
it's you're the donor, it's your money. We say
it's
that a lot.
exactly, and it's like it shouldn't really even, you shouldn't have to talk about donor intent. It should just be obvious, inherent. But the reason it's important is because all the pressures pushing back, I think, against the exercise of donor intent.
So back in 1999, 98, 99, you are formulating the idea for Donors Trust. You're working with our late founder, Whitney Ball, co-founder with you to get this off the ground. You put donor intent right at the heart of what Donors Trust is all about. Were there any particular, you don't have to throw anybody under the bus, you don't have to name names, but were there any particular incidents? You were coming out of the philanthropy roundtable, you were seeing a lot of different philanthropists do different things. Was there some precipitating incident that kind of launched you to say, gosh darn it, we really have to have something for donor intent?
Yeah, there was. It was sort of a series of incidents, but yeah, it actually started back in the early 1990s when Whitney and I were running the philanthropy roundtable. What was, and again, back then, donor advised funds, no one knew what they were. They hardly existed, right? There were some that a smattering of them existed, but even the Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund, I think, only launched in the early 90s. And so, in those days, donor advised funds weren't common, but donors who were looking for that kind of a vehicle to do their giving through, for that ease of administration, and being able to make a single contribution and give grants out from there, those donors tended to look to community foundations for their giving. But the community foundations, there were two issues that we spotted there. One was just, most community foundations are basically oriented towards helping their local communities. And so if a person who was doing their giving through the community foundation wanted to give to something outside that geographic area, there could be pushback. The other thing, and this is what really precipitated the idea for Donors Trust, is we began hearing from more and more of the roundtables members who were using community foundations, that the community foundations were refusing to honor their requests to give to organizations on the right side, conservative, somewhere on the right side of the political spectrum. So it was like, you know, oh, we should have a community foundation for the liberty movement. So that's really how it all started, and it took a while. That was the early '90s, and as you know, it wasn't until 1999 that we were actually funded or founded, sorry, and funded. But that was really it was the precipitating event was just the pushback that conservative owners were getting in their need for an alternative vehicle.
So, how has that changed over time? How is that idea of donor intent, that uptake, understanding of it, but just the process by which the donor community actually takes it on? How is that? Do you think that it has evolved in the last 25 years?
So, where Donors Trust is concerned, I mean, it was founded on the principle of donor intent. That's what we wanted to be able to honor, and it's why we called it Donors Trust. That you should trust. Yeah, the donors should trust in us to execute their intent, and protect their intent. Um, I should say. Uh, and many of Donors Trust clients, I believe, choose Donors Trust for that reason, because they have that confidence. And as you know, we ask all our clients to sign a donor intent statement, so we know how to carry out their wishes if they're not around to. And Donors Trust is different from other DAFs in that way. Say the commercial DAFs, our interest is not in managing the money, the way some of the commercial DAFs are. It's not in it's not a geographic location. We want to protect the intent of donors who are committed to liberty. We don't want to, we're not interested in donors who are committed to expanding the government. They can do their thing, but our interest obviously is in people who want to preserve and protect liberties. I think over time, donor intent has it's just become more and more elevated as a principle that should guide the philanthropic sector. And I think, Donors Trust does. It's the Philanthropy Roundtable. It gets a lot of credit for basically putting the concept of donor intent on the map. But I think one thing that's happened is people have come to understand how they don't take the honoring of their intent for granted anymore. They know there are pressures out there that uh, are will threaten their intent if it's not protected. And so I think it's really, again, much of donor intent, the impulse for it, the importance of it, stems from the pressures that are trying uh, to dishonor people's intent and to compromise it.
And you mentioned that donor intent statement. That is something that we at Donors Trust are putting a lot of emphasis on this year. It is our goal to talk to every single client. So all of you who are joining here today, if we haven't already, we're going to be talking to you about that donor intent statement. Either you submitted one maybe a long time ago, maybe you've updated it, but it needs to be current because your taste change, things change, and even just getting eyeballs on it is really important. And they can be lovely expressions. I had somebody on this call who's actually sent me an update today, and it was just lovely. It was just really nice to see how they phrase, this is what we care about, these are the passions we have. So kind of running with that, you've been on different boards and had roles in philanthropy for a very long time. When you talk to people about how to formulate their donor intent, how to put pen to paper on it, what are some of the key key of advice that you offer to them?
So, in terms of protecting your intent, there are three things I typically will emphasize. The first is a very good statement of your intent, a mission statement, whatever you want to call it. I always used to say, put it in writing. Now it could be a video. It could, times are changing. However you want to do it, but um, formulate uh, in a way um, that anyone who might be called upon to execute your philanthropy when you're not around, that they will understand. And I think that's actually more complicated than it sounds, because when we think of our giving, things seem obvious to us. It's, oh, I believe in free markets, and well, you got to put a lot more meat on that for someone to be able to execute upon that mission, right? And so, um, there are lots of things to emphasize. One is simply the principles that guide your giving. Another is the kinds of things you like to invest in. Is it research? Outreach? Is it, video content? Is it, um, you know, and, uh, and basically making it granular enough that someone can come in and interpret, your intent, including what you don't want to support. You can learn as much from what a donor isn't interested in as what they are interested in. And so, one piece of advice I give people is to read your mission statement like you are from the left, like you're Elizabeth Warren, whatever, whoever you most, don't want to have executing your philanthropy, and see how could that person basically twist your meaning? How could they somehow find a way to insinuate their objectives into your mission statement? I recommend have other people read it, try and poke holes in it. What do they not understand? How can you do it better? And essentially, you just want it as airtight as possible, because people will drive a Mack truck through a mission statement if they are determined to do that, and if they can. So the second thing is the people you choose to help you with your philanthropy. Um, uh, it's very important. And one important thing I think, is to get them involved with your giving while you are doing it. If you just, assign, say, with DonorsTrust as successor advisors, but they're not engaged with your giving when you're alive, it'll be much harder for them to understand and follow what you would have wanted if you hadn't been engaged while they were making the decisions. Um, so the other thing is, it's not enough to find people who you trust, who were close to you, whether it's family or outside advisors, and an attorney, or whatever, a longtime business associate, whatever, a close friend. Those, you might find people who want to honor your intentions, who will do their best, but they also need to understand how to do that. So they can understand, oh, you believe in liberty, but do they know the organizations working that you're interested in supporting? Do they know the whole landscape? And so I think it's really important to have people uh, helping you with your philanthropy who have a granular understanding of the issues and the organizations that you're interested in supporting. Third thing, and this is my hobby horse, sunsetting. You're always going to hear that from me. No matter how good your mission statement is, how good the people are who you entrust your giving to, the only sure guarantee that you're not, and it's not even, that's not a guarantee that things won't go off the rails, but sunsetting is the best protection you have, I think, against things going astray with your giving.
That that is terrific. Your answer right there was worth the cost of admission, which admittedly was free, but far outpaces it. Hope people get the recording of this and watch that section again. And I've heard you talk about sunsetting, wholeheartedly believe it. Talk about people, wholeheartedly believe it. I've never heard what you said there about pretend that you are reading this as if you were, Elizabeth Warren or somebody of the left, the person you least want executing your donor intent, because if it's airtight, they're kind of stuck, and the more airtight you can get it, that was great. That's a really good point, and it kind of goes to my next question, which is, you're on, for example, the board of the Roop Foundation, and Mr. Roop passed away several years ago, so now you are helping to guide the giving of a donor who's no longer alive. Uh, for those of us on the call, we don't want to think about it. But one day we will no longer be alive and somebody will be in that case of carrying it out. What are the challenges we should be mindful of now in anticipation of somebody else carrying that out?
Yeah. Again, it's really easy when the donor is sitting around the table, right? And that when that's going on, you are learning from the donor. That's your role, so that you understand what to do when they're gone. The difficulty occurs when they're gone. And again, I would just repeat that having your advisors engaged while you are living and learning to how you think, how you like to give is really important. You know, people people can read a mission statement, but and think they understand it is very different from having sat or sat with a donor and watched them participated as they make the decisions. I often say it should, it should be more like should be like a seance afterwards. What would the donor have done, right? Which and often something will fit within a mission statement, but if you know the donor well enough, that they wouldn't have wanted to do that, and that's really important. But so again, it's engaging people while you're alive. The other thing is that's really, really hard is anticipating how things might change. And things are always going to change. And the longer your your foundation or your DAF or whatever is in existence after you are gone, the more likelihood that things will change. And it's, you can, if your objective is to support orphanages, well, that changes over time. If it's an educational institution that might, change its stripes, its philosophical approach, or might go out of business. So trying to anticipate, I've said like you need to be really specific and granular, but on the other hand, you need to anticipate, and it's impossible, but how things might change. And I'd say like one thing we're facing right now in our movement is a lot of institutions, if you're interested in the public policy sphere, there's a lot of scrambling of the narrative. We're all used to the old Reaganite approach to the conservatism is splintering. We have Nat Con's traditional conservatives. It's all over the map, and the institutions that represent those values are changing. And so, you might have said, I believe in this institution more than anything other. You got to remember that institution can change. And so, the more, so I think, it is really important for donors in leaving an intent statement to just try to anticipate as best they can how things could change down the road.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to get personal for a second because I know you love that. I mean, I've known you for a long, long time, but what's your donor intent?
so okay, you warned me you were going to ask this question. So, and when I read it in your email, I thought, well, what a stupid question. So, um, you know, in part because, the amount I give personally compared to all the donors I've advised over the years just sort of seems inconsequential, really. I mean, to me, it's not, but it's all relatives, right? So, but y- y- when I thought about it, I thought, one reason it kind of seemed stupid to me is as an advisor to donors, you are always trying to see life through their eyes. Whoever it is you're advising, you're not thinking about your intent. You're trying to interpret the world through their lens and how they would see it and how they would want their philanthropy directed. So, through the course of my career, my intent has been irrelevant to what I have done. And I've advised donors who have, they've all been, for liberty, but within that, that spans a wide spectrum, and they've had very different approaches to how they tackle that objective of supporting liberty. And so, uh, you just need to think the best you can, like they do. So, having said that, that's why I thought it was a stupid question. Now I'll try and answer it. So, um, And in my own giving, such as it is, I'm like a lot of donors. I support the organizations that I'm most closely involved with, the ones I'm on the boards of, and they're the ones that get their tentacles into you the best. But they're also the groups I most believe in, and so um, one thing I would say is that um, I tend not, with minor exceptions, to support what I might call sort of feel good organizations, feel good charity, or you know the the groups that actually help people directly. And I tend not to do that. The reason I don't do it isn't that I don't think those groups are important. They're the those civil society groups are the foundation of our society. My thinking on it is that a lot of other people are are going to be more likely to support those organizations. So, they're the ones that pull at your heartstrings. And, maybe I don't have heartstrings, but um, my own view is fewer people are going to support policy organizations. It's harder to understand it. It's harder to get your mind around as a philanthropic objective. And so, and the way I see it is everything else we do, all those civil society organizations depend on us maintaining our individual and economic freedom. If we don't have that, all those other organizations, it's just that they lose their ability to thrive. They don't have the money, they don't have the freedom. And so in my mind, the most important philanthropic objective is to support the institutions that will preserve our individual and economic freedoms.
Well, that was great, Kim. I really appreciate that. And you know what? You illustrated a point that you shared earlier, that you know what you're saying no to. And that's actually really, really important because it allows you to invest more deeply in the things you're actually passionate about. It's not, as you say, something that it means they're bad groups over there. It's just not your cup of tea. It's somebody else's cup of tea. I happen to know it's the cup of tea of other people on this call. And that's great. That is what we want. Also, I'll echo one other thing, or reframe one other thing. You say, such as it is that you're giving. I think there's a lot of people on this call and elsewhere that we work with, some who don't have a lot to give, some who have a lot to give, still think that what they're doing is never enough. But, as I like to say, you don't have to be a billionaire to have your donor intent go astray. And so it is really important to be thoughtful about this, whether you're giving away $10 a year or $10 million a year. And so I appreciate the candidness and you sharing that. All right, don't go anywhere, Kim. We're going to go to Q&A in just a second. If you have a question, there's already a couple that have come in. Use that Q&A box and put your question in there. We're going to go through that in a second with Kim and also with Lawson. But first, Lawson, I want to ask you one question, and then we'll go to the Q&A. You came to Donors Trust 11 years ago. After many years in the nonprofit space, you worked at Mercatus, at Competitive Enterprise Institute. You had that nonprofit hat on. I'm curious, when you stepped into the role here, what was your perception of donor intent, and how has that changed and evolved over the last 11 years?
Good question. When I was running, those organizations, there was a single-minded focus on sort of the relationship between the donor and the respective institution. So, we dabbled a bit in legacy planning, which really what would happen to my organization when donor X passed away. But that was the extent of it. And as CEO, I was, thinking about the next 12 months. What's our strategy? What will be our goals? What would be our policy objectives? What would be the upcoming fight? How would the political landscape provide opportunity or obstacles? And we were really thinking about, for example, what would the institution do? Were we thinking about the idea of drift, for example, which really can be at the heart and the core of donor intent. So my point was, the concept of donor intent was not part of my psyche. It was a very compartmentalized relationship between an individual set of donors and my group. And then I come to Donors Trust and I realize, whoa, it's a lot bigger. It's a lot bigger concept. And so I understood, first of all, just the larger problem of donor intent and donor intent drift, and the real negative effect it has had on the larger conservative libertarian philanthropic community. I realize, my role and here, and that of, frankly, you and the rest of your team, Peter, is sort of to monitor the organizations, to monitor our grantees of really how they spend their money, not in any kind of micro detail, but over the long run. How much do organizations spend on compensation? What is spent on fundraising? What is spent on sending clients a lot of swag, for example? In other words, how's an organization behaving? Because that also goes to how we honor and fulfill the donor intent of our account holders, because that's not something that think tank CEOs are thinking about, but I, as a former think tank CEO, now do think about. A lot of organizations, I think, don't think seriously the idea of preserving their mission, and I can tell you they don't think about it at the board level, which is something they should think about. And then lastly, and Kim alluded to this, earlier in her conversation, I don't think we take seriously enough the threats to the larger conservative and libertarian community about the threats brought about by the commercialized philanthropic sector. It's kind of like the ocean, they come in waves, sometimes little waves, sometimes larger, and we get sometimes taken in when we're in the trough between the waves, when it seems calm. And just this last week, Peter, as you know well, where we were made aware of two situations where a couple of clients and grantees had some struggles with a couple of commercial DAFs about both making and receiving grants. And ultimately, it was worked out, but it, I think, came because they're in that center right space. So again, the challenge of preserving and protecting donor intent is still very real. And 11 years later, we're still dealing with that. So it's been, yes, a lesson learned, and here we are, and I'm glad we're able to continue this conversation. So,
Yeah. No, that's great. And to be clear, it worked out because those donors moved their funds over to DonorsTrust,
yeah,
yes, which was helpful too. All right,
yeah.
I'm going to invite Lawson and Kim onto the virtual stage together here, and we're going to do some questions. Again, put those in the Q&A box there. A couple came in. One person asked, Kim, if you could elaborate a little bit more about sunsetting. You wasn't sure about what the sunsetting clause really meant. Talk about that.
Okay, so uh, for it, first of all, at DonorsTrust, we require all clients to sunset their accounts a certain number of years after they're no longer around, if their account survives them. And I always forget how many years that is. How did you guys?
25
Yeah,
is
5 years after the death of the original advisor. And we also the original advisor can appoint a successor advisor, but the successor advisor cannot appoint a third successor advisor. So the clock begins to tick with the death of the original advisor.
And exactly. And then with a foundation, it's typically a matter of putting yourself out of business. So in most cases, although not always, there are foundation boards that decide to close a foundation, but typically it's the donor who establishes the foundation puts an end date on it. It might be some formula of how many years after the death of their youngest child or something, or their advisors, or it might be a specific date and time. But in any case, sunsetting a foundation refers to shutting it down after a certain period of time, and that with that time, it's determined by either the donor or the board.
And as we talk to people about updating their donor intent, we're really asking you to update that whole panoply of things: the successor advisors, final beneficiaries, but also that sunset period. I would say probably the median, Lawson, what would you say? The median fund at DonorsTrust probably has a sunset of about 10 years, maybe 15.
I think that's right. In fact, in many cases, the donor intent is very clear that there's actually a specific timetable set up when the proverbial bus comes along. I want this to sunset within. I think 10 is probably the max. It really depends, frankly, on the potential balance, and try to maximize what the gift is. But it's pretty rare that it exceeds that.
I'm sorry, can I just add there? I think it's important to note that at DonorsTrust, we really want your intent. If you die, we don't it's not like we say, oh, great, we get to spend that money. We don't want to do that. We wanted to give it away the way you wanted to give it away. And, we can look at your pattern of giving. That helps us a lot. And donor intent statement helps us, but we really need that, and we want to honor that. And I will say, if you would appoint a successor advisor who tries to do something that it would not have been within your intent, we'll step in. And it's not common, but when we have to do that, we do that.
There was a question about that advisor role, particularly in lifetime. What is the role of the fundraiser? We have several fundraisers on this call who are interested in this topic, or advisors working with a donor to understand that donor intent and over the long term. I mean, I think you answered this a little bit. Say it's really important, but any other color you want to add to that?
I mean, working with a financial advisor, or
I think any kind of secondary person who's alongside the donor to better understand their intent. Are there steps they can take? Are there things they can do?
outside of recording and writing and constant conversation, and, as Kim said, patterns of giving, and I mean, it's funny. Even what are your favorite books? I mean, alluding to again what influences you are in of itself helpful bits and pieces. I mean, anything that gets to the core values is of importance. Um, um, I mean, there's nothing that should be taken off the table to provide influence on what that means. And I alluded to, also just that patterns of giving from the grantee space too. It also, you know, I jokingly made the comment about swag, but sometimes intent is not just an organization trying to achieve a mission. Is the organization also spending money the way we think an organization should be spending money? That is also an interpretation that comes with donor intent. And that's something that a donors trust does, of monitoring an organization to make sure it remains faithful to the reasons why you gave to them in the first place. Sometimes it's a small point, Peter, but oftentimes an organization, it receives money because of who the CEO is. Well, what if the CEO changes jobs? That is sometimes following intent, is following the path of an individual or a researcher. There's lots of different reasons that go into why somebody supports a particular organization. So there's a lot of layers to what donor intent means, besides just, I like the organization because of they're suing the government. So
I just got to say, I have a closet full of swag that I love, Lawson.
well, I mean, yeah, some love it, some don't. So,
I was looking around my desk at the swag just within arm's reach of what I like here. So somebody asked the question, do we ever guide, or do you all, and I can answer this too, do you ever guide donors away from aspects of what they have put down as their donor intent, or specific organizations, presumably as things change, et cetera?
So, yes, to the extent that I think it is an advisor to a donor. Your role is to help them, most effectively carry out their objectives. And if they are thinking of giving to an organization or cause that you think isn't consistent with that, I think it's incumbent upon you to mention that. It's not that it's not you're trying to tell the donor they can't do that, but your role as an advisee is to share when you think they're making a mistake. And obviously, when they're alive, it's up to them. But it's again, I think it's you don't just go around issuing your opinion.
Yeah.
But when that's your role, yes, I think it's incumbent upon you to share that knowledge.
Yeah, you have to sift. There's a danger in gossip, and in infiltrating or filtering your own opinion into things and trying to decide the information that may be relevant to the donor's decision making process. But ideally, what's important to that donor. i.e., if you know that he or she gives because of a particular person and that person is having an issue or is leaving, then you feel like you should probably let that donor know. Sometimes, we are privy to information about, oh, the organization looks like it's really struggling financially. Well, that may be an opportunity for our donor to step in because they feel that that's relevant, or maybe that's a warning sign that the donor may want to be conservative. I don't want to make that judgment call, but it's probably information that they should be made aware of. So there's this balance. And ultimately, and this is a very important point, I know Kim has made it, DonorsTrust's role is to always give the priority to our account holder, unless the account holder has made DonorsTrust the successor advisor to the account, in which case we are making those decisions, but we are still making it with the guardrails in place.
And the one thing I'll add to that is sometimes an advisor's role can be to nudge donors to remember the things that they don't include, less cutting things out. So if a donor has this great donor intent statement, but you also know they happen to love this one organization, they're going to ride or die with that organization no matter what, but it doesn't really fit cleanly in the statement, pointing to them and say, don't forget this thing, because future generation may forget that this was really, really important to you. And if it's going to stay important to you, make sure you factor that in. This is really more a comment than a question, but a good one says, so appreciate Kim's statement about the how being an important method of defining donor intent, like how you give. So thank you, Kim. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, but it is a really important thing to think about. This is a good one. How does a good donor intent statement prepare for a favorite organization closing its doors or drifting from its principles after the donor's death? Is there a way to make sure that the statement itself, or is it really kind of going back to the question of how?
So a favorite organization drifts after the donor is no longer around. That's the
Or closes
issue.
its doors. I mean, Freedom Works
Right.
closed its
Yes.
doors a few years ago, right?
Yeah. So one thing I've seen is a donor to put in writing if said organization, and again, you're trusting your successor advisors there to make this judgment, right? But if an organization devolves away from what it was committed to, then it's not uncommon to name other organizations that would receive the funds, or simply you can leave instructions about if finding an organization that does something similar. But what I've seen mostly is basically identifying other organizations that would receive the funds if the named one isn't fulfilling its promises.
Yeah, Peter, we see this frequently. In fact, this just happened a month ago. So in some cases, we have accounts that we're going to call bequest accounts, right? Where there may be a small amount of money at a given time, and of course, upon death, that may be funded through various testamentary documents. And DonorsTrust is given the responsibility for fulfilling wishes. And in some cases, there's a list of organizations and that are important to this advisor. And maybe that list was given 10 years previously. And perhaps, as you say, 2 or 3 organizations are no longer around. But we can either make a decision based on the dollar amount, because you also want the grant to have meaning to the organization. And we can say, well, this organization doesn't exist, but here's another one that serves the exact same purpose, is ideologically in the same camp. So we can either substitute that, or if there are only 5 organizations and here's the dollar amount, we'll just take the remaining 5. Let's say 2 are no longer around, but 5 are. And we'll take those dollars and we'll disperse them among those 5 because it's going to make more of an impact among those 5. Sometimes we have to make a judgment call. That is true, but we still want to remain faithful to who and what that person was, which is why, again, specificity matters to us. And there are organizations that come and go, and there are organizations that do change their mission and do have an ideological drift. And sometimes we can look at where the groupings were of when the individual gave us that list, and we can kind of see where he or she fits in that larger universe. There's tweaks and there's clues, and we're going to follow those clues. But the point is that we're going to take it extraordinarily seriously.
And of course, the best thing is just to give it away while you're alive. Then you don't have to worry
Yes.
about this. Just give it all away.
All right, this is going to be the final question. I'm going to combine a couple questions here, both about sunsetting. One person asks, what happens after the fund sunset? One is about how do you avoid essentially kind of dumping a lot of money at the end if you're sunsetting? I'll take a quick stab at this, which is to say one of the reasons it's so important to have that sunset period established early is, one, you're no longer with us. If it's a 20-year period and there's $1 million in the fund, we have a sense of, okay, how much should be going every year? What's the investment strategy, so that you're not dumping it all on one organization at once? In fact, that's one of the benefits to using a donor advised fund as part of your legacy strategy, so that you don't overwhelm an organization with a lot of money all at once and maybe they can't handle it, or that they need 10 years of runway for your giving. Um, and so post sunset, one of the questions we do ask is, who are those charitable beneficiaries? If there's a little bit of money left that can't get doled out, there's $10,000 left that doesn't quite split up evenly, where would you like those last dollars to go? And that's an important question too. It's a confusing one, frankly, on our form, but it's an important one nonetheless. And if you decide, but Lawson, you take this piece of it. What if you change your mind? You're with us. You're going to sunset. Oh, that's well and good. Then you start thinking, perpetuity would really be great. What happens then?
Well, we should have that conversation while you're alive. I will just say DonorsTrust policy, as I say, is that we do sunset every account, and that is our policy. If you're a current account holder and you desire next generation to go in what would be beyond that, then we should probably have a conversation about what that looks like. We certainly care about the ideological component of a gift and wanting to sustain, especially the conservative and libertarian movement, and oftentimes that may mean figuring out ways to do that within. So, if that's something that matters to you, then I would just say let's reach out and have a conversation and see how we can maybe satisfy both parties.
We're going to wrap up the Q&A there. Lawson, I'm going to give you the last word in just a minute. First off, thank you, Kim, so much for sharing all your wisdom with us. Before I give it to Lawson, I just want to remind you, this is actually part one of a 3-part webinar series that we are doing. This one about what donor intent is in the first place, but coming up on April 22nd, we're going to do another webinar on how to craft that statement. We're going to go deeper into that great question, that great answer that Kim gave earlier. We're going to unpack that a little bit more. And then on May 12th, we're going to pull back the curtain a little bit and show how we steward your legacy if it is with us, and give you a little breakdown of that. So with that, Lawson, why don't you close this out?
Thanks. Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Kim. Just in closing, it is easy for us as donors, and I put myself in that category, to neglect the details. But if I can just say one thing, it is important, if nothing else, to write how and why giving matters to you. What are your motives for giving? In a world of shifting alliances and nuance and ideological perspectives, it's those motives that often provide the clarity when I and my colleagues are sort of faced with making decisions about how to properly steward, your account, right? Preserve your intent when maybe we lack certain details. And it is an old saying, but we do very much mean it here at Donors Trust when, help us help you. And by doing that, we hopefully also continue to move in the direction of a more free and prosperous society. So think about the why, think about the what. Make sure that is clear, because that's also an important legacy to pass on. If nothing else, it provides some important perspectives. It gets you thinking about the motives yourself of why you give.
Well, I hope you found that helpful. As I mentioned at the top, this was the first webinar in a 3-part series, the next one being on April 22nd, focusing on how to craft your donor intent statement. And then one more on May 12th that's going to look at how we at Donors Trust take those intent statements to help carry out people's legacies. So would love to have you join if that is interesting. If you are considering donor intent and how to apply it for your own giving, then look at the show notes. You can register there. We're not going to air those webinars here in the podcast feed, but we would love to have you as a part of them. So you can sign up today. So go find that out. Of course, if you just have general questions, webinar can't answer every question about your own donor intent. And so if there's a question that we can answer for you, if you want to talk it through, explore how Donors Trust can be helpful, whether you're already working with us or maybe considering it, then go to DonorsTrust.org and you can reach out to us that way. Email us at tellmemore@DonorsTrust.org. Give the office a call, whatever you want to do. We would love to chat with you about how Donors Trust can be helpful, how to think about donor intent. It's really that important. It's such an important concept. Well, we're going to be back with a more traditional interview episode very soon. So until then, thank you for being a giver. We'll talk more soon.